Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're jumping right into an explainer on a condition that literally affects millions of people around the world, yet it remains wildly misunderstood. We're talking about bipolar disorder. But look, in this explainer, we aren't just going to rattle off clinical data and biology. We really want to explore the lived experience, the inside-out reality of what it actually feels like to walk around with this diagnosis every single day. I want you to just take a second and imagine something. What is it really like to navigate a mind that constantly swings back and forth between an unstoppable electric euphoria and a completely crushing heavy despair? It's not just, being moody or having a rough week. It's a total systemic hijacking of a person's energy, their need for sleep, and honestly, their very perception of reality. It is an exhausting way to live, and stepping into the shoes of someone facing this, that gives us a much-needed perspective. Okay, let's dive into this. There is this huge and often really tragic disconnect when it comes to the hypomanic or manic phase of the illness. From the outside, it can actually look incredible. People might appear super productive, bursting with high energy, and displaying intensely increased creativity. They might seem like the life of the party. But look at the other side. The internal reality, it's highly stressful, incredibly volatile, and for many, just deeply painful. People experiencing this often feel entirely out of control, unable to stop their racing thoughts or impulsive behaviors, even when they desperately want to. And then the pendulum violently swings the other way. The depressive phase crashes in with an intense wave of fatigue, profound hopelessness, poor eye contact, and just persistent sadness. What's absolutely vital to understand here is that for most people with bipolar disorder, these crushing lows actually last significantly longer than the manic highs. And because people typically only seek help when they feel terrible, not when they feel euphoric, this phase very often leads to an initial misdiagnosis of standard major depression. But the most terrifying paradox occurs when these two extremes actually collide. It's called a mixed state. Imagine having these grandiose, rapidly racing thoughts, but combining that with an excessive, paralyzing guilt. Your body is buzzing with high physical energy, but your mind is sinking into total despair. It creates an incredibly volatile situation with a severely high risk of suicidal behavior. And it's frequently complicated by intense anxiety and sometimes substance use, as the person just desperately tries to self-medicate the pain.
Let's move to part 1, navigating the clinical spectrum, and see how this builds.
So let's look at the actual medical framework doctors use. This condition isn't just a one-size-fits-all illness. It exists on a really complex spectrum. Take bipolar 1. The defining feature here is at least one full manic episode, which can actually be severe enough to require hospitalization or even trigger psychosis. Depressive episodes happen a lot here, but technically they aren't required for the diagnosis. Then you've got bipolar 2. Here, individuals experience hypomanic episodes, so that milder yet still super disruptive form of mania, along with one or more major depressive episodes. And finally, cyclothymia. This involves a history of alternating hypomanic symptoms and periods of mild depression. They might not quite meet the clinical threshold for a major depressive episode, but make no mistake, they still heavily disrupt daily life. And this brilliantly illustrates that bipolar disorder rarely exists in a vacuum. A staggering 71% of people with bipolar disorder also battle anxiety, 56% struggle with substance abuse, which often starts as a desperate attempt to quiet their unpredictable moods, and 36% have co-occurring personality disorders. This heavy overlapping of conditions makes the journey to clinical stability incredibly complicated for the patient. But the clinical data is only half the story. We have to zoom out from the hospital room to the streets. Which brings us to part 2, the harsh socioeconomic realities. Consider this staggering number for a second. 8%. That is the estimated global prevalence of bipolar disorder among the homeless population. To put that into perspective, the general global prevalence of bipolar disorder in the wider population is roughly 1 to 3%. So we are seeing a rate among unhoused individuals that is several times higher than the general average. So how exactly does a medical condition lead to this? Well, it's a brutal cycle of housing instability. It often kicks off with early illness onset, combined with poor medication adherence, which honestly is common when someone's mind is actively deceiving them about even being sick. That instability leads to step 2, job loss, extreme poverty, and eventually eviction. Step 3 is life on the streets, which brings profound sleep deprivation and extreme stress. And step 4, that lack of sleep and high stress directly fuels and immediately worsens the manic or depressive symptoms. It locks the individual into a devastating loop that is almost impossible to break out of alone. Now, the data completely dismantles a major societal stigma. The myth we often see in movies or the media is that people with severe mental illnesses are unpredictable and violently dangerous to others.
But the statistical reality tells an entirely different story. People with severe mental illness are actually 4 times more likely to be the victims of violent crime, including a greater risk of sexual violence, than they are to act as perpetrators. They are incredibly vulnerable.
And tragically, the greatest threat they face is often internal. People with bipolar disorder face an 11.7 times greater risk of dying by suicide compared to the general population. I want to just pause here to force a moment of reflection on the absolute gravity of this illness. It is a lethal condition if left unmanaged, and treating it is literally a matter of life and death. But the narrative doesn't stop at these grim statistics. There is hope, there are solutions, and there's a vibrant community fighting for change.
Moving into Part 3, Finding Balance, Treatment and Advocacy.
So, the crucial point is that while the statistics we just discussed are terrifying, effective management drastically changes the outcome. These life-saving interventions are foundational. Lithium, a classic mood stabilizer, actually has the best clinical evidence for actively bringing that high suicide risk back down. Atypical antipsychotics are crucial for safely managing acute manic episodes, but medication isn't enough on its own. Psychotherapy helps patients process the heavy weight of the diagnosis and learn to cope with life stressors. And all of this requires consistent, uninterrupted care to prevent the devastating cycle of relapse. But even with great care, relapses can happen. And that brings us to this powerful quote stemming from the advocacy of the late Carrie Fisher, who famously went public with her diagnosis back in 2000. Public figures have fought fiercely to humanize this condition and erase the social stigma. As the quote says, relapses do not indicate a lack of discipline or moral shortcomings. This is a biological reality, not a failure of character.
And that humanization truly thrives in community. The power of support networks is undeniable. You have organizations like the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance, offering patient-run advocacy. Bipolar UK runs 85 different support groups. There are amazing initiatives like the Me/2 Orchestra, founded by a conductor with bipolar disorder, combating stigma through community music. And we even recognize World Bipolar Day on March 30th, which happens to be Vincent van Gogh's birthday. Research proves that participating in these patient-led support groups is directly linked to increased functioning and well-being. Community is a medical necessity, not just a luxury.
As we wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative question. How can we shift from judging the symptoms to supporting the human being behind the diagnosis? The next time you encounter someone acting erratically or hear a story about a manic episode, I challenge you to remember the painful inside-out reality they are experiencing. Your empathy combined with real societal support can be the very thing that helps them find their balance. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex topic. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you in the next explainer.